Mothers kissed their children goodnight and watched them die of thirst. The sky turned copper, then stayed that way. Lips cracked open, bleeding onto parched tongues that could no longer form words. Within weeks, sometimes days, entire villages emptied into desperate migrations toward water that didn't exist. The roads out of Serra became lined with bodies too weak to continue. Vultures circled so thickly they blocked the sun. Then the silence came. And across northeastern Brazil, one question haunted every survivor: how many more days until rain? This was not ancient history. This was 1877. The same year Thomas Edison was perfecting the phonograph in New Jersey, and Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. 500,000 people were dying of thirst in a corner of South America the world chose to ignore. Serra, Pernambuco, Rio Grande do Norte, Paraíba, these provinces in Brazil's northeast were not barren deserts. They were semi-arid scrublands, yes, but they had sustained life for centuries. The retell, as locals called it, was harsh but predictable. Rains came between January and May. Families planted beans, manioc, cotton. Cattle grazed on caatinga shrubs. Markets in Fortaleza bustled with traders selling leather goods and dried beef. It wasn't prosperity, but it was life. Sustainable. Rhythmic. The people of the retell were adapted to scarcity. They knew how to read the sky, when to plant, when to store. Their resilience was built over generations, refined through cycles of dry and wet. And in early 1877, they waited for the rains as they always had. January passed. The sky remained clear. February came and went. No clouds. March arrived with scorching heat. By April, the truth became undeniable. The rains weren't late. They weren't coming at all. The trigger wasn't mysterious. Meteorologists would later identify it as an El Nino event, one of the strongest ever recorded in the 19th century. In the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from Brazil, water temperatures shifted. Warm currents disrupted normal atmospheric circulation patterns. The result was a redistribution of rainfall across the entire globe. India suffered. China suffered. And northeastern Brazil, which depended on the intertropical convergence zone shifting southward each summer, was left with nothing but relentless sun. The technical term is teleconnection, a butterfly effect of planetary scale. A temperature change in one ocean alters the fate of millions on another continent. But the farmers in Serra didn't know about ocean currents. They knew only that the ground beneath their feet was turning to dust. Crops withered before they reached knee height. Wells that had never run dry began to fail. Cattle, already thin from months without pasture, started dropping dead in the fields. By June 1877, the migration began. Families abandoned their homes, taking what little they could carry. They walked toward the coast, toward Fortaleza, toward anywhere that rumor suggested might have water. Thousands became tens of thousands. The roads couldn't handle the flow. And then came the first deaths. Dehydration kills in stages. First comes the thirst, overwhelming and all-consuming, pain that radiates from the throat into the chest. Then the skin begins to lose elasticity, shrinking tight against the skull. Eyes sink into their sockets. The body cannibalizes itself, burning muscle for moisture. Children went first. Their smaller bodies couldn't survive more than 3 days without water. Mothers carried dead infants for miles, unable to accept what had happened, unwilling to leave them on the roadside for the vultures. But eventually, they had no choice. The roads into Fortaleza became lined with corpses. Families collapsed within sight of the city, so close to imagine salvation but with nothing left to give. Those who made it inside found no relief. Fortaleza's population exploded from 25,000 to over 100,000 in a matter of months. The city had no infrastructure for this. No food reserves. No clean water distribution. Refugee camps formed on the outskirts, but calling them camps is generous. They were open-air dying grounds. Dysentery spread. Cholera followed. Smallpox erupted in the overcrowded shelters. People who had survived weeks of walking died within days of arrival, not from thirst but from disease incubated in desperation. Provincial authorities tried to respond, but the scale was beyond comprehension. President João Lins Vieira Cansancao de Sinimbu in Rio de Janeiro, over 1,000 miles south, received reports but moved slowly. Aid shipments were organized, but by the time they arrived, the death toll had already climbed into the tens of thousands. And still, it didn't rain. The horror wasn't just in the dying. It was in what survival demanded. There are accounts, documented in provincial records and missionary letters, of families selling children to passing traders in exchange for water. Not metaphorically. Literally handing over sons and daughters to strangers for a single gourd of liquid. Priests in Fortaleza wrote of mothers who stopped crying because their bodies no longer had moisture to produce tears. One Carmelite friar, Fray João de Santa Gertrudes, recorded walking through a camp where the smell of decay was so thick he vomited before reaching the entrance. Inside, he found people too weak to swat flies from their faces, their skin covered in sores from exposure and infection. He wrote, "They lie waiting for death as if it were mercy." Contemporary newspapers in Recife published engravings of skeletal figures clustered under trees, their faces blank, their bodies motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of breathing. In the countryside, the situation was worse. Entire villages simply ceased to exist. Travelers passing through the Sertão months later found homes abandoned mid-meal, tables set, utensils in place, as if families had vanished mid-bite. Cattle carcasses littered the roads, bloated and rotting under the sun. The stench carried for miles. And over it all, that merciless sky. Blue. Cloudless. Mocking. By the time the rains finally returned in early 1879, the damage was irreversible. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly. Record-keeping during the disaster was sporadic at best, but most historians place the number between 500,000 and 1 million dead across the Nordist provinces. That's 1 in every 10 people in the region. Gone. The exact figure will never be known because entire communities disappeared with no one left to count them. Mass graves were dug outside Fortaleza, but they filled so quickly that bodies were eventually just burned in open pits. The smoke could be seen from the coastline. Survivors spoke of the sky turning black not from clouds but from funeral pyres that burned for weeks. The social fabric disintegrated. Property laws meant nothing when there was no government to enforce them. Banditry surged. Armed groups roamed the interior, stealing whatever remained. Women traveling alone were at unspeakable risk. The few functioning authorities were overwhelmed, outnumbered, powerless. In some towns, informal militias formed to protect water sources, killing anyone who approached without permission. Trust, the invisible currency that holds communities together, evaporated as quickly as the reservoirs. And when the rains did return, the land had changed. Topsoil had blown away. Seed stocks were gone. The cattle herds that had taken generations to build were decimated. Recovery wasn't a matter of months. It took decades. The Brazilian Empire tried to forget. Official records downplayed the death toll. International attention was minimal. A famine in a peripheral province of a second-tier empire didn't command headlines in London or Paris the way disasters in India or China did. But the people of the Nordist didn't forget. The Grande Seca, they called it. The Great Drought. It became a cultural scar, referenced in folk songs and literature, a warning passed down through generations. The poet Antonio Conselheiro, who would later lead the Canudos rebellion, preached that the drought was divine punishment for the sins of the elite. His message found fertile ground in the traumatized Sertão. And in a bitter irony, the disaster accelerated migration patterns that would define Brazil for the next century. Nordestinos fled south to São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, seeking work in the coffee plantations and early factories of the industrializing southeast. They became the backbone of Brazil's labor force, but they carried the memory of 1877 like a genetic inheritance. Don't trust the sky. Don't trust the government.